The marketplace buzzed with laughter, chatter, and the clinking of coins. Stalls overflowed with fruits, spices, and bright cloths, and in the middle of it all, they walked side by side, husband and wife. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, her face glowing with the kind of smile that made neighbors whisper, "Such a devoted wife she is." She nodded politely at the women who praised her beauty and whispered admiration behind their palms. She leaned closer to him in public, making everyone believe she adored him. He played his part too, because why wouldn't he? To him, she was the blessing he had prayed for, the partner he had promised to protect. When people saw them together, they saw a picture of harmony, love, and togetherness, the perfect couple. He often felt proud when the village elders said, "You are lucky, son. A wife like her is a treasure." But what they saw was only the image, carefully painted, like colors brushed over cracks in a wall no one dared to look behind. At home, her eyes lost the sparkle. The smile that lit up her face outside disappeared like a candle blown out by the wind. The woman who stood close to him in front of others now moved away as soon as the door shut. She no longer placed her hand on his arm, no longer looked into his eyes. The silence inside the house pressed down heavier than the noise of the market ever could. He tried to bridge the gap. Some evenings he brought her sweets wrapped in paper, just as he had done when they were first married. She accepted them with a polite nod but never ate them in his presence. At family gatherings she laughed at his jokes, but in private she rarely spoke a word. One evening, he found himself staring at her across the dinner table. The food was there but no warmth. He asked gently, "Are you tired? You've been quiet." She looked up for a brief second, then lowered her eyes to the plate, saying only, "I'm fine." That was all. Nothing more. Yet in the morning when they stepped outside, she transformed again. She greeted neighbors, clung to his side, asked him in a sweet voice about his day, even brushed imaginary dust from his shoulder in front of others. People smiled, convinced that this was love, the kind of bond they longed for. But he knew. He knew the truth behind her perfect image. The bed where they lay had grown colder than stone. The house that echoed with her cheerful voice in public was silent within. She was his wife before the world, but inside the walls of their home she was a stranger. The hardest part was not her distance but the confusion that consumed him. Did I do something wrong? He wondered. Did I fail her somehow? Night after night he searched for answers, replaying their memories. He remembered how she had once laughed freely, how her eyes had once searched for him even in a crowded room. What had changed? Why was her love now something she wore only like a cloak when others were watching? Still, he never told anyone. How could he? To admit the truth would mean shattering the image she had so carefully built. The same neighbors who praised her loyalty would never believe him if he confessed that their perfect marriage was only a stage play. He felt trapped between her performance and his own silence. One day, as they attended a wedding, he saw her laughing among the women, her voice rising above the music. She leaned on him, whispering things for everyone to hear, pretending as though their bond was unbreakable. People watched and sighed, "May our daughters find such love." He smiled, though inside his heart ached. He wanted to scream, "This is not real. You don't know what it's like when the crowd leaves." But he couldn't. And so the act continued. She was a wife in public, graceful, kind, devoted. But in the privacy of their home, he lived with a stranger whose heart seemed locked behind a door he no longer had the key to. The perfect image blinded everyone except the one man who had to live with the truth. The heavy wooden door creaked shut, and with it the world outside seemed to vanish. The noise of the streets, the greetings of neighbors, and the smiles they exchanged all dissolved into silence. The moment they stepped inside their house, the air grew still, almost suffocating. He turned to her, expecting the same warmth she had shown just minutes ago in front of others, but her face had already changed. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, and the soft curve of her smile straightened into a flat line. She walked past him, her footsteps echoing against the stone floor, and without a word, disappeared into another room. This was their routine now. Publicly they were partners, bound together in every step. Privately they were strangers sharing the same roof. He longed for her words, her laughter, even her anger, anything that proved she still felt something. Instead, she moved around him like a shadow, present but untouchable. At the dinner table he tried to start conversations. "The market was crowded today," he said once, hoping she would respond. She nodded, eyes fixed on her food, chewing slowly as if each bite was an excuse not to speak. Another evening he asked, "Do you remember when we visited the river last year? The way you laughed when the children splashed water?" Her fork clinked softly against the plate. "I remember," she said, and then silence swallowed the room again. He couldn't understand it. When they married, she had been full of life, her words flowing like a river that never ran dry. Now she barely looked at him. Sometimes, it felt as though she didn't even see him, as though he were invisible. Nights were harder. They lay on the same bed, but a wall of distance separated them. He would shift closer, hoping she might turn toward him, but she always turned the other way, her body stiff, her back a silent rejection. He whispered her name once, quietly, as though saying it gently might open the lock around her heart. But she did not answer. Her breathing remained steady as if he hadn't spoken at all. Days turned into weeks, and the silence became a wound. He carried it with him everywhere, hidden beneath the mask he wore for the world. His friends envied him, telling him, "You are lucky to have such a devoted wife." He smiled back, though deep inside the irony cut deeper than any knife. Sometimes he sat alone in the courtyard, staring at the night sky. What changed? He asked himself again and again. Why does she push me away when no one is watching? He thought of asking her directly, demanding an answer, but something always stopped him. Perhaps it was fear that her silence would only confirm what he dreaded most, that she no longer loved him. She, too, kept her distance without explanation. When he entered a room, she found an excuse to leave. When he spoke, she answered only with words that carried no warmth, no emotion. It was as though she had built walls so high that even his love could not climb them anymore. One afternoon he returned home early. The house was quiet, except for the faint sound of her voice in the next room. For a moment his heart leaped. She was speaking, her tone soft and almost cheerful, but not to him. She was on the phone with someone else, her laughter light, flowing, alive. The sound pierced him. How easily she gave her voice to others, when she couldn't spare even a single word for him. He stood there, frozen in the hallway, listening to her laugh, a laugh he hadn't heard directed at him in months. When she ended the call and stepped out, she saw him standing there. Her expression hardened instantly, as if the smile had been erased. "You're home early," she said flatly, brushing past him without another word. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, his heart heavy with questions. Was she ever truly mine? Or has she always been a stranger I mistook for a wife? The silence beside him offered no answers. Behind closed doors, the truth was crueler than anything the world outside could imagine. She treated him not as her husband, not even as her companion, but as if he were invisible, a ghost drifting through the rooms of his own house. And he, desperate for even a scrap of her affection, stayed silent, hoping that one day she might look at him and truly see him again. The aroma of freshly cooked food filled the air as the family gathered for a wedding feast. Plates clattered, children ran between chairs, and laughter rose above the music. At the long wooden table, he and his wife sat together, side by side. She leaned close to him, offering him bites of food with her own hand, her laughter ringing clear when he teased her about taking the biggest piece of meat. Everyone around them smiled, whispering, "What a loving wife she is. Look how she cares for him." He smiled too, though a quiet ache tugged at his chest. He had learned to play along, to wear the mask she demanded when others were watching. To outsiders, their bond was enviable, a love story painted in the colors of joy. But he knew the truth waited for them at home, behind the same doors that always turned warmth into coldness. Later that evening, when the guests were gone and the candles had burned low, he set the dinner table in their own house. The room was quiet, save for the scraping of bowls and the crackle of firewood. She sat across from him, her face expressionless, her eyes fixed on the food instead of him. He placed a piece of bread on her plate, hoping for a thank you or even a glance. She said nothing, only tore the bread into pieces without lifting her eyes. He cleared his throat, trying to fill the silence. "The wedding was beautiful tonight," he said softly. She nodded, chewing slowly. No words followed. He tried again. "The bride seemed nervous, but you made her laugh." She looked more at ease after that. This time, she simply pushed her food around the plate, avoiding his gaze completely. It wasn't just silence, it was avoidance. She refused to look at him, as if meeting his eyes might expose the distance she wanted to keep. He sat there, forcing himself to swallow bites that tasted more bitter than the food itself. He wanted to ask her why. Why did she laugh so easily in front of others but turn her face away from him when no one was around? Why was their table at home colder than any empty street outside? Memories haunted him. He remembered when meals were filled with laughter, when she used to reach across the table to take his hand, when they shared small stories of their day until the food grew cold from too much talking. Now, silence was the only guest that joined them, sitting heavily between their plates. One night he tried something different. He placed her favorite dish on the table, carefully cooked the way she liked, and waited for her reaction. For a brief second, her eyes lit up, but only faintly, before dimming again. "Thank you," she said flatly, then went back to eating without another word. He had hoped it would spark conversation, but the silence only grew heavier. Sometimes she would finish quickly and leave the table while he was still eating. He watched her retreating figure, feeling the emptiness stretch across the room. He began to dread mealtimes, not because of the food but because of the hollow loneliness that came with them. Eating together should have been a moment of connection, but instead, it reminded him of how far apart they had drifted. The contrast between public and private gnawed at him. In public, she leaned close, laughed, and even fed him bites of food, her hand brushing his arm as if she couldn't bear to be away from him. In private, she turned her face away as though the very sight of him soured her appetite. It was a cruel performance, one that everyone else admired but one he had to endure. One evening, as he sat across from her, he dared to speak his heart. "Why do you do this?" he asked quietly, his voice trembling. She paused, the spoon halfway to her mouth. "Do what?" she asked, her tone flat. He swallowed hard. "Out there you laugh with me. You touch my hand. But here, when it's just us, you won't even look at me." For a moment he thought she might finally tell him the truth. She set the spoon down, her eyes flickering with something, anger, sorrow, or maybe guilt. But then she stood, pushing the chair back. "You're imagining things," she said coldly. "Eat your food." And just like that she left the room. The half-empty plates sat abandoned on the table, the silence heavier than ever. He stared at the chair she had left behind, his heart aching with a truth he could no longer deny. She was his wife to the world, but here, at their table, in their home, in the place where love was supposed to grow, she was a stranger who refused to meet his eyes. And so, every meal became a reminder. A reminder that the laughter others admired was only an act, and that the love he longed for lived only in public, never at the table where it mattered most. The lanterns glowed warmly as neighbors gathered in the courtyard for the evening feast. Music drifted through the air, and people laughed while passing plates of roasted meat and steaming rice. In the center of it all sat the two of them, husband and wife. She leaned against him lightly, her hand resting delicately in his as if it belonged there forever. Her smile was radiant, her laughter soft, and her fingers intertwined with his in a grip that spoke of love, loyalty, and trust. To the onlookers it was a picture of devotion. Some whispered, "What a bond they share. Look how she clings to him." Others nodded with envy, their eyes full of admiration. She had perfected the art of appearing to be the ideal wife, one who never let her husband feel alone. He smiled too, but his smile was heavy, forced. Every time her hand squeezed his in public, he felt the sting of a truth only he knew. The moment they returned home, her hand would be the first thing she pulled away. Later that night, when the guests had left and the torches outside had burned low, they stepped back into their house. He reached for her hand again, hoping the warmth she displayed earlier might linger now that it was just the two of them. But she slipped her hand free almost instantly, as if his touch burned. Without a word, she walked to the far side of the room, leaving him standing alone in the silence. The contrast was unbearable. In gatherings, her fingers laced through his like vines clinging to a tree. She smiled when he spoke, leaned into his shoulder, and even rested her head against his chest in moments so carefully timed that others would sigh and say, "This is what marriage should look like." But in private she recoiled. He could stretch his hand toward her, but she would shift away, pretending to busy herself with meaningless tasks, folding cloth that didn't need folding, arranging dishes already arranged. It broke him in ways no one else could see. He yearned for that closeness, not the staged one in public, but the real, unguarded touch of a wife who loved him. He longed to feel her hand in his when there was no audience, no eyes to impress, no whispers to feed. But her affection lived only under the gaze of others, and when the lights dimmed, so did her performance. One evening, at a village gathering, she clung to him more tightly than ever, her fingers locked around his. People laughed and teased, "You two are inseparable. She never lets you go." He chuckled along, though inside the words stung. If only they knew the truth. If only they saw her hands turn to stone when it is just us. That night he tried to speak. After returning home, he gently touched her shoulder. "Why do you always pull away from me?" he asked softly, almost pleading. She turned, her face blank, her eyes sharp. "Not everything has to be questioned," she replied coldly, brushing past him. Her hand slipped out of his grasp once again, leaving behind the emptiness he dreaded. His mind filled with memories of when her touch was real. In the early days of their marriage, she would grab his hand without hesitation, her fingers playing with his as they talked late into the night. Her warmth had once been his comfort. But now, every time she let him hold her hand in public, he felt the hollowness of the gesture. It wasn't love, it was a mask carefully worn for the world. He began to hate those gatherings. He hated how her hand in his fooled everyone into believing what he longed to believe. He hated the pitying envy in people's eyes when they said, "You are blessed with such a wife." He hated the way she used her touch as a performance, while in the quiet darkness of their home, he reached for her and found only distance. One night, in the stillness of their bedroom, he reached out again. His hand hovered close, trembling with hesitation. He whispered her name, hoping she would not turn away this time. But when his fingers brushed hers, she flinched. Slowly, she pulled her hand back under the blanket, leaving him cold. He lay there in silence, staring at the ceiling, realizing her hand, the very thing that symbolized connection to others, had become the sharpest reminder of his loneliness. Her mask fooled the world but not him. He lived with the truth every day. She was willing to give him her hand in public but never her heart in private. And the absence of her touch in their home was louder than any applause she earned outside. He sat alone in the courtyard one evening, the soft glow of the oil lamp flickering against the walls. The night was quiet, broken only by the distant barking of dogs and the chirping of crickets. She had already gone inside, claiming she was tired, but he couldn't bring himself to follow. His mind spun in circles, chasing the same question that haunted him night after night. Why was she one person in public and another in private? In front of the world she was his partner, his shadow, his strength. She laughed with him, spoke to him with tenderness, and leaned against him as though her heart beat in rhythm with his. But when no one was watching, she became someone else entirely, cold, silent, distant. The shift was too sudden, too sharp, like a door slamming shut in his face. He tried to understand it, but every explanation escaped him. Was it something I did? Did I hurt her without realizing? The thought gnawed at him until his chest felt heavy. He remembered their first months together. How she had been open and warm, her words flowing like water, her laughter filling their home. She used to sit beside him in the evenings, sharing stories about her childhood, her dreams, her fears. He would listen with fascination, grateful that she trusted him with pieces of her soul. Now that same woman seemed like a memory he could no longer touch. At meals she avoided his eyes. At night she turned her back to him. And during the day she floated around the house as if he didn't exist. He spoke but she rarely answered. He reached out but she slipped away. Yet the moment they stepped outside together she wore her mask again, affectionate, attentive, devoted. His confusion grew into a silent storm. He searched for answers in small details. Maybe she was tired? Maybe she was sick? But no, her laughter with others proved she was neither. Maybe she was angry? But she never voiced complaints, never argued, never shouted. Silence was her weapon and indifference her shield. One night, unable to bear it any longer, he asked. They were sitting in the same room, the only light coming from the dying fire. He looked at her and said quietly, "Why do you change when we are alone?" She froze, her hands stilling on the cloth she was folding. Her eyes flickered toward him, then away. "I don't know what you mean," she replied calmly, too calmly, as if she had prepared for the question long before he asked it. "You do," he insisted, his voice breaking. "Out there you smile at me. You hold my hand. You speak as if I am your world. But here," his throat tightened. "Here it feels like I don't exist." Her lips pressed into a thin line. She offered no explanation, no comfort. Instead, she stood and walked away, leaving him staring into the fading flames. His confusion turned into self-doubt. Perhaps she regretted marrying him? Perhaps she stayed only because of what others would say if she left? Every time she ignored him, he felt himself shrinking, wondering if he was the problem. But then why did she pretend at all? If she truly despised him, why bother holding his hand in gatherings? Why laugh at his jokes when neighbors were around? Why go through the effort of playing the perfect wife if she felt nothing inside? The questions consumed him, circling endlessly without answers. He lay awake at night, his back to hers, staring into the darkness. Were you really? The woman who clings to me in front of others, or the one who cannot stand me when we are alone? He wanted to believe the public version was real, that somewhere beneath her silence lived the woman he had once known. But with each passing day that hope withered. Her indifference became his reality, and the mask she wore outside became a cruel reminder of what he had lost inside. And so, he carried his confusion like a stone in his chest, heavy, unshakable, and growing sharper with time. He smiled in public because she demanded it. He laughed when people teased them because that was the role he had been forced into. But deep inside, he lived with a question that would not leave him. Why does she love me only when others are watching? Marriage was supposed to be a union of two souls, two lives woven together into one. That's what he believed when he stood beside her on their wedding day, surrounded by blessings and prayers. He imagined a future where their laughter would fill the walls of their home, where their conversations would stretch into the quiet hours of the night, where her presence would be his comfort and his strength. But the reality was nothing like the dream. Their house, though not large, was filled with silence. The kind of silence that weighed on his chest and pressed against his ears until he felt suffocated. She moved about like a shadow, her footsteps soft, her words scarce. She fulfilled the duties expected of her, cooking meals, keeping the house tidy, greeting guests with a smile, but beyond those tasks she was distant, unreachable. There were nights when he sat on the edge of the bed, staring at her back as she lay facing the wall. He whispered her name, but she never turned. He tried to touch her hand, but she pulled it away, pretending to be asleep. And though she was only an arm's length away, she felt as far as the horizon. It was then he realized a cruel truth. Loneliness inside marriage was deeper than the loneliness of being single. A man without a wife knew he was alone. But a man with a wife who treated him like a stranger, that was a wound no one could see, a hunger no one could feed. In public they were the image of happiness. She stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her voice gentle when she spoke to him in front of others. People admired them, saying, "You two are blessed. What a bond you share." He nodded, smiled, and carried their words like daggers in his heart. Because once they returned home, that bond dissolved into silence again. He began to dread the nights most of all. The evenings dragged endlessly, filled with the sound of his own breathing, the ticking of the clock, and the weight of her absence, though she was right there beside him. He tried to keep himself busy, fixing things that didn't need fixing, arranging tools he rarely used, sweeping corners already clean, anything to avoid the crushing stillness. But no matter what he did, the loneliness followed him like a shadow. He longed for simple things. A smile meant only for him, not for the neighbors. A word of comfort when his shoulders sagged with weariness. A hand reaching for his in the darkness, reminding him he wasn't alone. But those simple gifts never came. He was married, yet he felt more abandoned than ever. One night, he sat in the courtyard, the stars scattered across the sky like broken glass. He remembered the stories elders used to tell him, that a wife was a man's companion, his shelter, his safe place. He wondered if those stories were lies, or if perhaps he had been cursed with a bond that looked whole on the outside but was hollow within. Tears burned his eyes, though he wiped them away quickly, ashamed of his own weakness. No one would believe him if he told them. The world saw only the mask she wore outside, the perfect wife who laughed and leaned on him. If he confessed the truth, people would dismiss him, accuse him of lying, or worse, blame him for failing her somehow. So he suffered silently. Loneliness became his constant companion. It sat beside him at the dinner table, where her silence echoed louder than any noise. It lay between them in bed, a wall that grew taller each night. It followed him into the marketplace, whispering in his ear even as she clung to his arm for all to see. He was not without a wife. But he was without love, without warmth, without connection. And that emptiness was more painful than anything he had ever known. As the days turned into weeks, he began to wonder if this was his fate, to live married but alone, to walk beside her in public but wander alone in private, to be bound by vows that no longer carried life. The world saw him as a man complete, but in truth he was a man broken. For the cruelest kind of loneliness was not sitting in an empty room. It was sitting in a room with the one person who should have been your everything, and realizing she was already gone even while she was still there. The evenings were the hardest for him. After the laughter and noise of the village gatherings, after the smiles she had shared so effortlessly in public, the silence of their home returned like a punishment. She would change out of her bright dress, remove the bangles from her wrists, and sit in the farthest corner of the room, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. To him, it felt as though she shed not just her ornaments, but her entire self the moment the door closed behind them. He had once thought it was just tiredness. She smiled too much outside, maybe she simply wanted quiet when they were alone. But as days turned into months, the pattern became too sharp to ignore. She never reached for his hand unless others were watching. She never asked about his day unless someone else was listening. And worst of all, she never let him see what was hidden behind that polished smile. One night he tried again. "You looked beautiful today," he said softly as they prepared to eat. Everyone kept talking about you, how lucky I am. Her lips curled into a practiced smile, but she didn't lift her eyes. They always talk. I mean it, he pressed, his voice gentler now. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about us. I'm talking about you. Her hand paused for a moment on the clay bowl she was holding, then resumed as though nothing had been said. She served him food, placed the bowl before him, and sat back in silence. It wasn't anger in her silence, it was distance. A wall so thick it left him stranded on the other side. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay awake, watching her in the faint glow of the moonlight that slipped through the cracks in the window. Her face looked calm, almost peaceful, but he knew better now. Her peace was a mask, and behind it something heavy was buried. What was she hiding? The question gnawed at him. Did she regret marrying him? Was her heart somewhere else? Or was it something darker, something painful she could not bring herself to share? He remembered once, long before their wedding, when he had seen her sitting alone under a neem tree. She had been crying then, quickly wiping her tears when she noticed him. Back then he had thought it was nothing, a fleeting sorrow. But now he wondered if those tears had been part of a story he was never meant to know. The more he tried to connect, the more she pulled away. Yet in public she was flawless. She laughed at his jokes, adjusted his shawl when it slipped, and spoke to others as though they were the happiest couple alive. It was a cruel contradiction. A wife to the world, but a stranger to him. He tried another approach. Instead of demanding answers, he offered pieces of himself. He began sharing small confessions. His fears, his dreams, his mistakes. He hoped that by showing his own heart, she would find the courage to reveal hers. One evening as they sat in silence, he whispered, I sometimes fear I am not enough. That maybe I'm failing you somehow. Her eyes flickered with something raw, but it vanished too quickly. She shook her head slightly, then turned away. Why won't you tell me? He asked, his voice breaking. Why do you smile for them but not for me? Why do I only see the shadow of you, never the real one? For a moment she seemed ready to answer. Her lips parted, her hands trembled slightly, and her eyes filled with unshed tears. But then just as suddenly she shut it all away. I don't know what you mean, she said flatly, her mask snapping back into place. That was when he realized the truth. She was carrying something she believed he could never understand. A burden that had shaped her, scarred her, and chained her heart in silence. She had her reasons, hidden, locked away. Perhaps they were wounds from her past, secrets too painful to speak aloud. Perhaps they were promises she had made to someone long before him. Or perhaps they were fears of what he might do, of how her truth might shatter the fragile image she maintained in front of the world. Whatever it was, it left him in a prison of loneliness. That night he did not reach for her. He simply lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. He wanted to believe that one day she would trust him enough to tear down the walls she had built. That one day her hidden reasons would no longer be secrets but truths they could share. But until then he remained the husband who was loved in public and left in the shadows in private, forever chasing the smile she wore so easily for everyone else. Their marriage had become a performance, a stage where love existed only for others to see, not between them. In the marketplace she slipped her hand into his, her laughter ringing like bells so everyone could admire the perfect couple. At family gatherings she leaned on his shoulder, her voice soft, her eyes gentle, making everyone believe their bond was unshakable. But when the doors of their home closed and the walls grew silent, all of that affection disappeared like smoke in the wind. At the dinner table, her eyes stayed on the food, never meeting his gaze. When he tried to talk, her replies were short, clipped, and cold. At night, she turned her back to him, the bed wide and empty though they lay only inches apart. He reached out sometimes, hoping to feel warmth, but she shifted away as if his touch burned. He began to notice the gap between the world they showed and the reality they lived. The smiles she gave in public weren't for him, they were for the image of a happy wife, for the approval of others, for the picture-perfect life that everyone admired. Behind that mask, their connection was broken, fragile threads barely holding together what had once been love. He wondered when it had started. When had she begun to drift so far that even their silences felt like walls? Did she ever truly love him, or was it all just a role she played because society demanded it? The questions kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling while she slept soundlessly beside him, a stranger in the same bed. And yet, every morning they stepped outside together, their hands brushing, their faces glowing with affection that didn't exist. The village clapped for their love story, never realizing it was only a play. Inside he felt the ache of a man who had everything in the world, except the one thing he longed for most, her heart. He carried his pain quietly, like a stone pressed deep inside his chest. Day after day, he hoped that silence would one day turn into love, that patience would soften her heart. He never raised his voice, never demanded affection. He simply waited, believing that the woman who once smiled at him with warmth would return. Each morning he rose before her, preparing tea just the way she liked, placing it gently by her side. She barely noticed, sipping without a word, her eyes distant. At night, he lingered by the doorway, watching her brush her hair, hoping she might glance at him the way she used to, but her reflection in the mirror was colder than the glass itself. In public, he let her shine, never interrupting her laughter or stealing her spotlight. People admired him for his calmness, for being the quiet husband who adored his wife endlessly. They never saw the ache in his eyes, the way his heart crumbled every time she looked past him as if he were invisible. He could have spoken. He could have asked her why, demanded answers, begged for the truth. But his love was too gentle, too afraid of breaking what little connection remained. Instead, he bore the weight in silence, convincing himself that if he just waited long enough, she would come back to him. But nights stretched into months and months into years, and she remained closed, locked away behind walls he could never cross. His silent pain grew heavier, carving lines across his face, dimming the light in his eyes. And still, he waited, because even in her distance, she was the only woman his heart had ever chosen. To the outside world she was flawless. Her laughter filled gatherings, her hands served food with grace, and her words painted her as the perfect wife. Neighbors envied him, friends admired his luck, and elders praised the harmony of their home. Everyone believed they were the couple others should aspire to be. But behind closed doors, the silence was louder than any applause. He walked into rooms where she was present yet distant, her eyes fixed on books, screens, or empty space. Their conversations rarely went beyond necessity. The food is ready, we need to visit my parents, the bill must be paid. The tenderness that once existed had evaporated, leaving behind a marriage that looked alive only from the outside. He tried to bridge the gap, small surprises, late-night talks, gentle questions, but her walls never lowered. Sometimes she smiled in front of others, the kind of smile that could light up an entire room, but he knew it was a mask. A performance. He had front-row seats to a play that fooled everyone except him. And so, the world continued to applaud her, unaware of the truth he carried in silence. The truth that he lived with a stranger, a woman who shared his home but not her heart, who wore the title of wife but withheld the warmth of a partner. He never exposed her. He never shattered the illusion others admired. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of love, or perhaps because he hoped that one day she might step out from behind the mask and let him see her again.